Hello everyone, welcome to yours and my favorite part of the week at your online Psych, Culture, and Society class. Today we're going to talk about motivation, so let's jump right into it. Beginning with themes from this chapter, different cultures often approach the same task with different goals and different motivations, and they often focus on different aspects of the task. Such differences can subsequently affect how people from different cultures react to people and events in their environment. And let's begin with two concepts, self-enhancement and self-esteem. And let's begin by defining self-enhancement. It's defined as the motivation to view oneself positively. According to research conducted mainly in North America, people have a strong need to view themselves positively. Self-esteem, how positive one's overall evaluation of oneself is. Most people in a North American cultural context report having high self-esteem. Having high self-esteem means that that the person thinks he or she is great, whereas low self-esteem means that the person thinks she or he is inferior. Evidence that a culture promotes self-enhancement comes from cultures that demonstrate high self-esteem. For example, 93% of white Canadians in a study scored above the midpoint of a self-esteem scale. So we have two concepts here. The first being self-enhancement, which is kind of thought of as kind of your motivation to view yourself positively. So kind of just that desire to view yourself in a positive light. And self-esteem is really that your evaluation of oneself, how good you are, how great you are at whatever thing. So that's so self-enhancement, the motivation, and self-esteem is your overall evaluation of how great you are. And those two constructs are associated with each other, at least in North American studies, wherein individuals with, in cultures that promote self-enhancement have higher rates of self-esteem among their population. In this study, 93% of white Canadians scoring above the midpoint of self-esteem scale, which basically just means they scored above average on this self-esteem scale. Self-serving bias, which is a tendency for people to exaggerate how good they think they are. Measures revealing a self-serving bias serve as evidence for the motivation for self-enhancement and self-esteem. It's usually seen with attributes that do not yield concrete negative feedback, such as when over 94% of professors think that they are above average professors, which is not statistically possible. If people are accurate in their perceptions, about 50% should think they are about average, and 50% should think they are below average. Bias observed in elementary school students, high school students, and college students, and working adults. The question then is, what happens when people do receive negative feedback? How do they maintain positive self-perceptions? So basically what this slide is getting at is in cultures that place value or higher values on self-enhancement, and kind of, we saw the association between self-enhancement and self-esteem. So cultures that promote higher levels of self-esteem, we see a tendency for self-serving bias to occur at higher rates. And again, that's just kind of an exaggeration of how good they are. And you can ask this, and what this means about does not yield concrete negative feedback. You basically can just ask somebody, hey, how good of a professor you are in this example? And the majority of people in this study, the super majority of people, 94%, said that they are above average, which, by definition is not possible. And you see this, across numerous studies, and especially in North America and in some, parts of Western Europe as well. And it's also replicated, as I was saying, not just among professors, but various people, various groups, and across various subjects. So, are you good at X game? You're going to say, yes, I'm above average at game. And the majority of people will do so, which is, again, specific, not possible statistically. So the question becomes then, if people self-rate themselves above average at rates that are not possible, if you just ask them, aka not giving them any feedback at all, just free asking them, what happens if an individual receives feedback? How are individuals able to maintain positive self-perceptions? especially in cultures that place emphasis on high self-enhancement, but even in cultures that don't place as much emphasis on self-enhancement or self-esteem. Strategies for positive perceptions. And we're going to just outline them, and then I'll give some examples. Downward versus upward social comparison, which is comparing oneself to someone worse off versus better off. Compensatory self-enhancement, acknowledging negative feedback and then focusing on things one is good at. Discounting, which is downplaying the importance of the attribute. External versus internal attributions, attributing failures to factors outside versus within oneself. Basking in reflected glory, emphasizing one's connection with successful others. So kind of the idea here is kind of straightforward. Strategies for maintaining positive perceptions. So for downward versus upward social comparison, say I'm playing a video game, the new NBA 2K for PlayStation 5, and I suck at it. Well, one strategy to maintain my positive self-perceptions is I can compare myself to other people who are worse at the game than me. So I can say, well, at least I'm better than them, thus maintaining my positive self-perceptions. Compensatory self-enhancement, acknowledging negative feedback and then focusing on things one is good at. So then I could say, okay, yeah, I suck at maybe this year's 2K, but also I'm the best at this other video game, so I'm going to focus on that more. Discounting, so downplaying the importance of the attribute. I can say, well, this game here sucks anyway. It doesn't matter. Being good at this game doesn't matter because this game sucks and I have better things going on in my life. Attributing failures to factors outside oneself, external attribution. So I can just say, oh, my internet connection is bad, it's making me lag, it's making me suck, so that's why I'm not good at this game. Basking in reflected glory, emphasizing one's connection with successful others. So the idea here is that maybe my teammate is really good at NBA 2K, and they're on my team, and we end up winning even though I suck, and then I'll just focus on the fact that as a team, we won. So it's kind of like this connection to a successful other, but usually it's a successful other that you can make a kind of social connection to. In that case, me being in a team, but you can imagine a scenario where maybe you are performing poorly in high school, but your high school, I should say high school, I don't know, math class, and but your high school football team is awesome, and what an individual can do to maintain their positive perception is to focus on the fact that they are a part of a school with a great high school football team. So they'll start saying things like, we are really good at football, and kind of ignoring the fact that they're bombing their math class. Now let's talk about some cultural variation and self-enhancement motivations. Cross-cultural research reveals that self-enhancement is more pronounced in the West or in weird samples. A study on Mexican American and European American school children and elementary school children found that both groups of children viewed themselves positively. European American children viewed themselves positively on 90% of the positive characteristics, while Mexican American children did on 82%. There are striking cultural differences between white North Americans and East Asians. 93% of European Canadians report high self-esteem versus 55% of Japanese. Generally, self-enhancement seems to be associated with having an independent view of self. So kind of just briefly breaking this down is that typically research reveals that self-enhancement is more pronounced in weird samples, and the closer groups are to, the cultural values of a particular culture is, the closer their levels of self-enhancement motivations are. And in this case, the study found that children of European American and Mexican American children scored pretty similarly, but still kind of the white American children scoring higher. But you can kind of see the similarity, much closer distance compared to comparing white North Americans versus Japanese citizens, where Japanese individuals are only reporting high self-esteem, only 55% of Japanese individuals reporting high self-esteem versus 93% of white Canadians. So basically, the takeaway message here is that there are differences in self-enhancement motivations, and those differences can be more pronounced in particular cultures that have like kind of greater distance, not just physically, but kind of cultural values or the certain attributes that cultures promote across time. And this is just kind of a little easy table here. So just kind of looking at Euro North Americans versus East Asian, Asian Canadians. You can see that Euro North Americans are higher rates of external attributions after failures and discount importance of the task after failures versus East Asian / Asian Canadians, who are placed more external attributions after success and emphasize importance of task after failure. So you can see kind of the difference here with North Americans placing citing external attributions after failure, but for East Asians it's after success, and North Americans discounting after failure on a task, while East Asians emphasize the importance of the task after failure. So just one is kind of really focused on maintaining their independent sense of self, wherein if you fail, it's due to something beyond some other situation, not yourself. Whatever. The failure is not due to some internal reason, but rather an external reason. And if you fail, then the test sucks anyway. Versus East Asian, where if you succeed, it's not from yourself, but from some kind of larger context. And if you fail, you emphasize the importance of the task. Right, at higher rates, I should say. There are several alternative hypotheses for the cultural variation in self-enhancement motivations. One is that Western biases and research methods prevent us from seeing the East Asian motivation to self-enhance. They argue that East Asians do self-enhance, or do not self-enhance, but they group enhance, more so than European North Americans. Research suggests that European North Americans are more likely to both self-enhance and group enhance, however. Another explanation is that East Asians would show self-enhancement if researchers examine traits that East Asians actually found to be important to them. However, there is, at best, mixed evidence of this claim and plenty of evidence showing that this is not the case. Modesty norms prevent East Asians from reporting self-enhancement. Hidden behavioral measures and indirect measures find evidence for a cultural difference in self-enhancement. However, see these other studies for counter evidence, which is addressed by this other study. And then kind of like the summation of all this is that overall there's more evidence showing cultural variability. So kind of we have these different arguments and that are making the case that really there's not this variation, but rather either biases within the methodology of researchers and or researchers asking East Asians questions that are not relevant to them and kind of like not motivating to them to respond in a way that would suggest that they do have higher rates of self-enhancement motivations. And then also finally the final theory is that they're just too modest to say that they have higher levels of self-enhancement due to just norms within the East Asian countries. And while overall, as I stated, there is some evidence for some of these, more specifically the modesty norms and kind of the examined traits that East Asians found to be important to them, a little less so. But kind of overall, the consensus is right now, based on the evidence we have, is that there's more evidence that suggests cultural availability within self-enhancement motivations. Let's talk about some of those origins of cultural differences, or at least some hypothesized ones. Parental interactions and teaching. So, for example, Americans' Taiwanese parents have divergent views on the importance of self-esteem. And historical societal norms, example, 16th century Protestant Reformation, predestination, the idea that from after birth, that from before birth, it is determined whether a person will go to heaven or hell after death, a connection between Protestant beliefs such as predestination and self-enhancement. So let's begin with the parental interactions. Kind of just in general, American mothers consider self-esteem central to child rearing and feel that it should be cultivated. But Taiwanese parents feel that high self-esteem may be detrimental to the child. As a result, American parents tend to recall more stories about their children's past successes, whereas Taiwanese parents are more likely to recall stories about their children's past failures. At a societal level, American schools are more likely than East Asian schools to emphasize the development of students' self-esteem. So kind of the idea here is that, as stated, that the cultures place different values on self-esteem, which is reflected in parent interactions, and the degree to which and the frequency to which that different parents, in this case Taiwanese and American parents, recall past successes about their children or past failures. And we see that American parents tend to recall more stories about their children's past successes, while Taiwanese parents recall more stories about their children's past failures. And this is obviously reflected in numerous institutions throughout American and East Asian institutions and organizations. And one example would be schools, where American schools emphasize kind of self-esteem development and maintaining high self-esteems, which on average East Asian schools do less of. Moving on to more of a historical example, this is kind of like the Max Weber idea, this German sociologist. Not on the test, but it's kind of like one of the arguments here, one of the scholars who promotes this. And the idea here is that we have this predestination where before birth you're trying to it's determined who should go to heaven or who will go to heaven or hell. And during this period, this is a very tumultuous period. Life not great in the 1500s. And there's suffering all around you, and the idea is, okay, we have this predestination, but obviously you exist within the real world, right? And people are going to be curious to say, or look for ways to determine who is going to hell and who is going to heaven, not just themselves, but among their peers and their family. And so, trying to obviously they don't know if they're going to heaven and hell, but people are going to try and interpret the world around them, and are thus kind of motivated to interpret events around them in a positive light, I should say, because really any uncertainty or kind of any misfortune around them could be seen and it could be interpreted as a sign that the person was going to hell instead of heaven. So this kind of created this positivity bias, which ushered in kind of a increased culture of self-enhancement, and then these other views of kind of Max Weber at least argues where kind of values of capitalism come from, this kind of interaction between predestination, uncertainty, and needing and kind of new social relations or new economic models. But also even beyond that, in cultures that have less Protestant influence or just non-Protestant cultures overall, you see these higher levels of self-enhancement, in particular in cultures that have an independent view of themselves or kind of just general higher levels of individualism. So kind of in accordance with that idea, evidence in the United States suggests that as the country becomes more individualistic, people self-enhance more. As you can see from this figure, average levels of self-esteem have increased over the last several decades in America. So if you remember from previous lectures, the United States is becoming more individualistic, and not just that, but kind of the world in general. And so we're kind of seeing this correlation between increasing levels of individualism and people having higher levels of self-esteem as measured by this one particular scale, which again kind of provides evidence for that association. And the question being, will that trend continue, not just in the United States, but would you expect to see these trends in other cultures as well? Motivations for face and self-improvement. Rather than focusing on feeling good about oneself, people in collectivist societies focus on others feeling good about them. One term that's commonly found in collectivist cultures is face, social value given by others if one fulfills obligation and expectations. So instead of feeling good about oneself, but versus in an individual at higher rates in individualistic cultures, people in collective societies focusing on others feeling good about them, and we have this term FACE, which is kind of a abstract metric of social value an individual has based on their ability to fulfill obligations and expectations. Characteristics of FACE. FACE involves concern about how one is being considered by others. It is important to note that FACE is more easily lost than gained. Because FACE is easily lost, it's a good strategy to be cautious and avoid behaving in a way that might make others reject us. In cultures that are concerned with FACE, people have more of a prevention orientation than a promotion orientation. So kind of our big takeaway here is that we have FACE, which is our social value given to us by others for fulfilling certain obligations and expectations. And FACE is more easily lost than gained, so we're going to take this kind of preventative, cautious approach when behaving in the social world. Continuing on with the characteristics of FACE, because FACE is so easily lost, people want to avoid being rejected by others. Self-improvement, identifying potential weaknesses and working to correct them, helps minimize chance of others seeing you lose FACE. Prevention versus promotion orientation, striving to protect versus advance oneself and avoid negative versus secure positive outcomes. People are motivated to avoid loss of FACE, more prevalent among East Asians than North Americans. So let's briefly expand on these points. Self-improvement, so you can imagine in a collectivist society and kind of the FACE concept more generally, we are placing value on fulfilling obligations towards groups, people around us, versus kind of more an individualistic society where we're more focused on feeling good about ourselves and kind of just fulfilling our own, internal kind of quest, thus leading or contributing to differences in rates of self-improvement. Where in East Asian cultures, they are going to place higher levels or cultural value on self-improvement because you want to make sure that you improve and you're able to kind of fulfill those obligations that are required within your social surroundings. While an individual, someone who maybe has higher rates of individuality or living within a culture that kind of values that more and having more of an independent self, it doesn't really matter as much to me if I'm failing somebody else's expectations because I'm driven by my own kind of internal motivation, and my sense of self is really kind of this inner essence that is made up of certain personality factors that are unchangeable. And really my goal in life is kind of to find environments that match those personality traits and then just kind of succeed more generally on a personal level. And kind of to go over prevention versus promotion orientation, and beginning with prevention orientation. So this is really just this one tries to avoid negative outcomes. It's really this, like I said before, this defensive, cautious approach. Losing FACE is a negative outcome that people with prevention orientations want to avoid. And this strategy, this orientation, is more prevalent among East Asians versus the promotion orientation, where you're really looking to secure positive outcomes. It's kind of more of a defense versus like offense kind of situation. And again, kind of promotion, looking to secure positive outcomes, and it's more prevalent among North Americans. One study found that best-selling books have reviews on Amazon, including more preventive information in Japan, but more promotion information in America. So kind of the idea here is that individuals will, in kind of their daily lives, demonstrate these differences in orientation. And in this case, Amazon book reviews, wherein Japanese citizens having higher rates of prevention information versus American Amazon reviewers having higher rates of promotion information within their Amazon reviews. And this kind of gets back to this idea that it's really easy to lose FACE. So you got to take this preventative approach. I want to improve myself and kind of just be, cautious of when kind of interacting with the world versus a focus on individualistic cultures, on self-esteem, and kind of achieving and advancing my own individual kind of interests, which is kind of hypothesized to be kind of more just an aggressive individual, or linked to sets of aggressive individuals' behaviors in your daily life, and kind of more reflective in institutions across cultures. So let's talk about a specific study to make this a little more concrete. Differences in prevention orientation versus promotion orientations affect how one responds to failures. Prevention orientations focus on weaknesses to avoid future failures. Promotion orientation focuses on successes to strive for advancement. Accordingly, after failure, a person with a prevention orientation should persist more than a person with a promotion orientation. Example, Japanese engage in self-improvement more than Canadians. After success, people with promotion orientation persist more than those with prevention orientation. Canadians engage in self-enhancement more than Japanese. So kind of the takeaway here is that this study is finding that Japanese individuals, which have placed greater emphasis on face and kind of just collectivist values overall, and such as prevention orientation, continuing at higher rates, persisting at higher rates following failure at a task compared to more individuals growing up in individualistic cultures, in this case Canadians, who have higher levels of promotion orientation and kind of that more advancements and securing positive outcomes behavior. So what you find is that individuals, because Japanese individuals, that is people who value face more, are going to want to fix kind of their failures, kind of their flaws. They have higher rates of this self-improvement because it's pretty easy to lose face, and two, your collectivist culture, or higher rates of collectivism within a culture, contributes to higher rates of kind of focusing on others feeling good about me fulfilling my expectations and obligations within our social society. Versus this Canadian sample having higher levels of promotion orientation and looking to just secure positive outcomes and kind of minimize positive outcomes, kind of to maintain that self-esteem. There's really kind of less of an obligation to continue to perform badly on a task. There's less reason to persist versus at following failure, I should say. Versus kind of after success, like, okay, now I've identified a task that's something that I am good at. Now I can my abilities, my kind of fixed abilities, my inner essence kind of is allows me to perform well in this task. It allows me to pursue my kind of natural innate abilities and goals, and it allows me to secure positive outcomes and advance myself as an individual by demonstrating success within this kind of realm. So you see differences in the levels of persistence for Japanese individuals, for individuals with higher rates of prevention orientation, persisting longer on tasks following failure, versus individuals within, in this example here, Canada, having higher rates of promotion orientation, more individualism, contributing to higher persistence following success on a task. Because face also involves greater concern about the perspective of others and their appraisal of us, people who want to save face are motivated to pay attention to the perspective of others. Some studies have found that East Asians pay attention to perspective of others more than Westerners. Besides using prevention orientation, people can also try to enhance face or try to present oneself to others in a way that increases social standing. For example, trying to enhance others' recognitions of one's status by purchasing brand name products. Interestingly, many consumers of brand name luxury goods are in East Asia, with more than half of Louis Vuitton businesses coming from that part of the world. So kind of the idea here is that because I'm concerned about the perspective of others and me fulfilling my social obligations, I maybe have higher motivation to pay attention to the perspective of others, particularly in my in-group. But there's another approach here. Instead of besides using prevention of orientation, is that you can try and enhance face by presenting oneself in such a way that increases social standing, and this can be done by just buying brand name things, which would suggest that I have higher social standing because I have this prestigious jacket or something along those lines. So you can see kind of similar actions taking place within the United States, buying this name brand outfit for arguably with arguably different concerns in mind. On the one hand, an individual trying to, meet some personal goal versus an individualistic culture, I should say, versus someone in a more collectivist culture wearing some name brand thing to increase their social standing, enhance their face, I should say. It's kind of one hypothesized reasons why it's thought that luxury goods are businesses are so prominent in some East Asian countries. Motivations for control. Cultures vary in perceptions of control. Their perceptions of controls are impacted by the implicit theories of self, which we talked about in our, I believe, previous chapter, but chapter 6, and implicit theories of the world. In 2 implicit theories of the world we're going to cover. The first is entity theory of the world, which is perspective that the world around you is fixed and beyond your ability to change it. First is incremental theory of the world. The world is seen as being flexible and responsive to our efforts to change it. Whether people view the world as amenable to change has consequences for how they choose to exercise control. So kind of the idea is we have an understanding of the world, and that understanding of the world, or the kind of the ability to change the world, or how fixed the world is, kind of interacts with or contributes or creates how much emphasis we place on our motivation to exercise control within our kind of everyday behaviors and kind of the real world in general. With entity theory of the world being believing that the world is fixed, you really can't change it. It just kind of is what it is, and your individual actions are not going to change it, or there could be higher levels of the groups maybe are unable to change it, but that varies. How many people it takes to change the world or whatever. But kind of the general idea here is the world is fixed and it's beyond your personal ability to change it. Versus an incremental theory of the world, where the world is kind of flexible, it's more reflective of your individual efforts to change it, or maybe even more collective efforts to change it. And the world is reflective to our efforts to change it. Okay, and there are 2 types of control that people may engage in. Primary control has also been examined under related terms such as internal locus of control, influence, and agency. It is the idea of primary control is that it's control associated with engaging in behaviors that reflect a belief that one can exert influence on the world around them. It's more common in the West than elsewhere. And secondary control is associated with ideas such as external locus of control and adjustment. This has to do with the control people engage in when they feel that they are not able to change the world, and so they must adjust their goals and desires and control the psychological impact of the reality. It's more common in non-Western contexts. So we have these 2 types of control here, and they're kind of known as different terms. You'll see things like internal locus of control, influence, agency, external locus of control. But kind of the idea here is primary control is easy way to think about this is maybe we are able to exercise primary control on the world around us. We exert our influence on the world around us, and the world kind of reflects our work on it. Whatever it is that we're trying to control or change about the world. The world will we're able to act on the world, and then our actions will reflect back to us in kind of our structures and our everyday life. Versus secondary control, it's this idea that you're less able or not able to change the world, so therefore you should kind of focus on adjusting your goals and desires and kind of controlling and kind of dealing with that psychological impact that you're kind of unable to exercise control of the world. So that's why it's external locus of control. And this is kind of related with the entity theory of the world versus the incremental theory of the world being more embedded in, or primary control, I should say, being more embedded in the incremental theory of the world. So as I stated, primary control is generally associated with having an incremental theory of the world, but is also associated with an entity theory of the self and an independent view of the self. The self should not have to change. It is stable, bound entity. The world is responsive to our efforts to change. People with interdependent selves tend to have more incremental theories of self, but entity theories of the world. The self is malleable and responsive to efforts to change, while the world is fixed and beyond our control. People thus exercise, quote, secondary control. They strive to adjust themselves and accept circumstances as they are. Secondary control strategies are more common in non-Western contexts than in Western ones, while primary control strategies are more common in the West than elsewhere. So, kind of as I said before, you can see kind of embedded within these terms particular views of the self, in particular views of the world around you and your ability to change the world around you. Where in primary control, associated with entity theory of the self, so kind of this idea that you have certain, we talked about this kind of in the personality chapter, but you have certain traits, you have a certain self that's bound, stable, certain kind of like essence to you. That's kind of unchanging, and your quest is to fulfill that and satisfy your independent desires, and kind of thus why it's related to the independent view of self. The a viewpoint that the world is able to change, but kind of I'm not able to change. I have to fulfill my kind of individual destiny, or kind of like chase my individual dreams, and that requires me acting on the world, and by me acting on the world is malleable and able to change, versus an interdependent self where it's kind of a little bit of the opposite, wherein the world is kind of less likely or unable to change. It's more fixed and beyond our control, but the self is malleable and is responsive to efforts to change. That's why you're going to engage in higher levels of self-improvement and kind of focus on exercising secondary control, wherein an individual tries to adjust and kind of accept circumstances as they are. And as I stated, secondary control strategies are more common in non-Western contexts than in Western contexts. So an empirical example of this is Morling 2000, who studied control strategies in the United States and Japan by giving questionnaires to people in aerobic classes in the two countries. When asked why people chose the class and what they do when the instructor initiates a difficult move, Americans were more willing than Japanese to choose classes at times that were more convenient for them. Japanese were more willing to choose classes based on the class's level being more appropriate for them. And Americans were more likely than Japanese to do their own move if the teacher's move was difficult. That is, their preferences determined their exercise routine. Japanese were more willing to try harder to do what the instructor did. So kind of the big takeaway here is that you see the differences of primary and secondary control and kind of the entity and incremental theories of the world. So Americans having higher rates of choosing classes at times that were convenient to them. So kind of like I have these individual desires, and I'm going to choose when I decide to. I'm going to select particular classes based on classes that are most convenient for me, or my kind of my immediate family. And you can see that Americans were more likely than Japanese to do their own moves. So say, the aerobic instructor says to do some whatever routine, and the move was difficult. And kind of the idea here is preserve self-esteem, and because they have high rates of self-enhancement in American culture, Americans will do a move that they would rather do than the one that's too difficult for them, because that will possibly hurt their self-esteem, for example. And so their own preferences are driving their exercise routine, and not the preferences or the kind of the recommended exercise routine of the expert found within their community, or in this case their aerobic class. Versus Japanese were more willing to try harder to do what the instructor did. So kind of going back to this idea of self-improvement, and maybe this aerobic instructor is seen as holding some role in society, who has an expertise in aerobic science of exercising in general, and it's up to individuals within that culture, in this case Japanese, to fulfill the expectations of the aerobic instructor and kind of perform their role as a student within this aerobic class. Group agency. Collectivist societies focus more on groups rather than individuals, perceiving groups as agents. Psychologists tend to equate agency with individuals rather than groups, which may reflect the field's development, which has been largely in Western and individualistic cultural contexts, reflective in how news outlets in different countries or cultures report on scandals involving rogue stock traders. One study compared newspapers in different countries, and the researchers analyzed whether newspapers focus on the individual, that is, the perpetrators convicted, or the group management of the bank. So before we get to these results, I just want to highlight here that kind of the idea here is that there's agency at the group level, and so we have different kind of attributions to where agency lies. That is at groups versus individuals, and there's kind of two different types of agency, groups and individuals, and with collectivist societies focusing more on group agency rather than individual agency. And kind of, you typically are not exposed to this because we live in a Western culture that is highly individualistic cultural context, where agency is placed on the individual. And I try to make that clear to my developmental classes constantly, that much of the psychology that we've talked about throughout this course is kind of is embedded in this idea of individualism, and thus the theories and kind of the focus of studies are on variables and constructs that contain particular individualistic values. So thus, like, if you ask kind of a psychology student if what intervention should be done or something along those lines, or which is the most important developmental aspect, or the important relationship within development, students in the West will typically say mother-child or mother-father, or something along the family lines, and intervention really at that family or maybe even community level, and less of those kind of structural, macroeconomic, political, public policy positions that kind of trickle down and contribute to particular interactions within a family and among peers and just everyday kind of behaviors in general. So it's just always interesting to find that in Western contexts, which is less common in different fields or different countries, which have different cultural values. Their emphasis on particular psychological variables are different, differ in the rates in which they stress kind of these collectivist and historical variables to measure in psychological studies. But moving back to our newspaper study, where we looked at newspapers, whether newspapers focus on individuals or group agency when kind of a scandal of rogue traders broke out. And what the results of the study showed is that there are cultural differences in news reporting. American newspapers, such as the New York Times, referred more to individuals than to their companies. And Japanese newspapers referred more to the companies than to the individuals. This coverage was observed in news coverage of scandals that occurred in both the West and Japan, Results suggest that Japanese may be more likely to hold groups responsible for outcomes, where Americans tend to think about events in terms of the individuals involved. So kind of the idea here is that you could take the same scandal, or even just different scandals, and just compare the frequency in which that the newspapers are attributing the malicious actions, or the criminal action, the rogue activity of particular actors to the group versus to the individual. And in East Asian context, and specifically in this study in Japanese newspapers, referred more to the company than to individuals, and thus kind of reflects the fact that Japanese individuals have higher likelihoods of holding responsible particular outcomes at a group level. That is, or agency is found at the group rather than at the individual, compared to American newspapers, obviously more individualized, individual agency theory of the self and kind of the world at large, thus describing newspapers describing the actions of rogue traders in kind of more individualistic terms, because agency is embedded within the individual. So you see these larger cultural messages embedded within and reflected in these newspaper articles, and kind of just really how you talk about politics and economics and these larger societal issues more broadly. Making choices. Primary control is perhaps most directly evident when people make choices. Making choices is emphasized more in North American contexts than elsewhere, and is more common in North American contexts than in other cultures. A number of studies have compared Indian and American perceptions of choice. Indians take much longer than Americans when making choices, suggesting decision-making is more difficult for Indians than Americans. Indians don't respond as negatively when denied their choice. Indians consider fewer actions as a matter of choice. And Americans view more important actions as a matter of choice. So kind of the idea here is that an individual within a culture that emphasizes primary control is going to place more value on making these choices, and respond more negatively when denied the ability to make a choice. And as the importance of that particular theoretical choice increases, the more a individual who is in a primary control culture, aka Americans, they'll view those actions, those important actions, as a matter of choice. So the more important the action is, the more emphasis on the importance of choice. So important actions contribute to the importance of making a choice. And versus kind of an Indian culture, which has more of a secondary or high rates of secondary control, having lower levels of negativity associated with being denied choices, and Indians considering fewer actions as a matter of choice. So not just that negative reaction to a lack of choice, but the expectations for choices among every single action is higher in cultures, in this case American culture, which has higher levels of primary control. So continuing on and making choices, other cultures will often leave important decisions to be made by close others, who care about them and know their needs and have their group's best interests in mind. So this is an important point to make, because the individuals in these cultures are often not giving up their choice to random outcomes or to someone that they're not close with, just some random person. It's typically the other person making a decision for them is very close, cares about them, as I stated, and knows a good deal about that person's needs and kind of their family needs. So in other words, the choice is made with the assumption that the decision maker has the group's best interests in mind. Now looking at a study on culture and choice in fifth graders, the computer game was chosen by either a child, an outgroup member, third graders from another school, or an in-group students in a child's class. Measure numbers of games and attempted motivation. So basically what the study is doing is they're having a game that an individual is going to play, I guess a PC game, and the game is either chosen, the game that an individual is going to play is either chosen by the child themselves, an out-group member, so it's just somebody from another class, or someone within their class. So who chooses the game that this individual is going to play? And then what the researchers did was they tried to find an association between that condition, which of the three groups you're in, and the number of games attempted at it, aka your motivation to keep playing the game. And the study found that white American children were most motivated to play the game if they chose it themselves, while Asian American children were most motivated if the game was chosen by their mother. So again, this goes back to the primary control, that motivation to make choices being higher among not just kind of Americans, but white Americans having higher rates of this need to exercise choice in kind of all circumstances, as reflective in their willingness to continue to play the game if they chose it, if are having higher rates of choosing to play the game if they themselves chose the particular game that they're playing, versus Asian American children being most motivated to continue to play the game if the game was chosen by their mother. Which also reflects, just that, not that like these individuals do not have any choice, but rather kind of delegating that choice, as I've outlined, to an individual who knows them well and has theoretically themselves and kind of their family, their social units' best interests in mind. So then the question becomes, is there such a thing as too much choice? Americans will say that they would rather have many choices. They often think the more the better. It is interesting to note, though, that having many choices can be detrimental. Making choices can deplete mental resources. Americans persist for less time and make more mistakes on tasks after making a series of choices. Choice is especially difficult in cultures placing high value on the outcome. In other words, high stakes make a choice more stressful. So kind of the idea here is that American culture in general believes that, the more choices you have, the better. You got to have 5,000 cereals that you have to be able to choose from, and that's better. There are, however, downsides to choices, and specifically kind of just some outlined here is that the more choices you make, the more mental resources you use, and thus you become more fatigued. And over time, as you make more choices, your ability to perform, efficiently and kind of effectively on a task decreases with the amount of choices you make, just because kind of the sheer exhaustion of making so many choices. And it's also reflected in research, as some of which we covered, suggesting that Americans persist for less time on something following making many choices, and this can be related to lower levels of self-improvement, but kind of just also just kind of exhaustion of having to make so many choices at every point, at every step of their lives. Everything's kind of like a choice, which depletes mental resources. And the final bullet point is interesting because you can imagine in a culture that places high value in face, so kind of in fulfilling the obligations within society, and that you can imagine that those individuals' choices can be more stressful, because it's not just you're making choices kind of for yourself, but rather kind of like your whole, at least your community or more than just yourself. Thus, this choices become more stressful, and the research shows pretty consistently that when making choices or doing any task under very high levels of stress, individuals perform less effectively on those tasks and make more errors and take more time. Despite such cultural variability in the perception of choice, we do know that having an absolute lack of choice or general inability to control life outcomes is generally associated with negative outcomes, decreased feelings of control associated with psychological cost. Learned helplessness is feeling powerless and unable to control or avoid unpleasant events associated with stress and depression. So kind of the idea here is that in this case of complete learned helplessness, you have no choice at any point of your life, zero control of your life, and do not believe you control literally any aspect of your life. And at that level of lack of control, lack of any choice, it's psychologists kind of refer to this construct as learned helplessness, where you just feel completely powerless and unable to control anything or in your life at all, which is associated with elevated stress and higher rates of depression. There are also class differences in choice, in the motivation for choice. People in working class contexts, and kind of just lower class in general, are more likely to face hardship and to have less control over their circumstances. Example, the choice in class study. Lower class and upper middle class Americans were asked to complete a survey in exchange for a pen. Participants were given a choice of pens, that is the free choice condition, or had the choice taken away, that is the usurped choice condition. In the free choice condition, they could choose any pen they wanted. In the usurped choice condition, they chose a pen, but then the experimenter said, "I'm sorry, you can't have that pen. It's the last one of its kind that I have. Here, take this one." The participant was then given a different pen. The experimenter measured how much participants liked the pen. Lower class participants liked the pen as much, regardless of whether they chose or had the choice usurped. But upper middle class participants were much less satisfied with the choice when their choice was usurped. So kind of this idea here is that lower class individuals have, and even in a Western context, just have, and in particular the United States, understand that they don't exercise choice in their life. They live their life. They have kind of less control over their circumstances. They're not affecting the macro culture and politics and economic systems, and they face more hardship in general. So this combination contributes to, or is hypothesized to contribute to, less motivation for choice. And in this study, kind of they measured this, where individuals again were either were instructed to select a pen, and there was two conditions. Either you just select the pen and you keep the pen, or you select a pen and then the researcher always stated, "Hey, you can't have this pen because we only have one of them left. Pick up a different pen." And then the researchers measured the degree to which they liked the pen, and for the lower class Americans, there was no difference in their the magnitude of how much they liked the pen compared to upper middle class participants, who are much less satisfied when they lose their choice. And you can kind of piecing it together here, upper middle class Americans kind of living, having more internalized notions of the larger culture, that is individual choice and kind of independent self, as we've seen in previous studies. The higher you are in the class ladder, the higher you are, or the more likely you are to the culture's values are more reflective. You internalize the culture values of your culture at higher rates. So in this case, in the United States, kind of this idea of making choices is automatically fantastic. So in upper middle class, people are used to making more choices in their lives. They have internalized this choice making worldview. They exercise primary control of their environment. Thus, when that choice is taken away, they're like, "Nah, screw this pen. I don't like this pen." While the working class participants who don't exercise as much choice, if any choice, within their daily lives and have less internalized notions of making choices, are kind of just happy having a pen. Either way. Motivations for conformity or uniqueness. Ash's conformity studies tested whether people would conform even when they were clearly aware they were doing so. Famous line studies, participants were shown a target line S and given 3 choices of different lengths. They were asked which one was the same length as the target line, and the answer was obvious or unambiguous. Key was that the participants had to give their answer after several Confederates gave incorrect answers. Confederates are people who work for the research team. Even though the answer was obvious, the majority, 75% of American participants in the study, conformed on at least one of the 12 trials in the experiment, showing that conformity is common even in an individualistic culture like the United States. Why did people conform? They may have been afraid of how others would react if they went against the group. In other words, there are social costs. So this is a classic study taught in general psychology. The idea here is it's a measure of conformity, and we want to make it, one, as easy as possible. Everybody can tell that the A line is not the same size as the S line. Okay, so we all see this, and there is no pressure on this person. The only pressure is that people in front of that participant are giving fake answers who work for the research team. So if I ask the entire group, hey, which of these lines is the same length as S, and just say, there's 10 Confederates, and every single one of them say, S and A are exactly the same height or length. And then the participant comes, it's the participant's turn to indicate which of the two lines are the same, and the majority of American participants conformed on at least one of those 12 trials. So 12 trials being, sets of lines, which demonstrates that conformity is common even in individualist cultures like the United States. And researchers argue that there's a social cost to not conforming. And even in circumstances where there's really not much pressure, there's just really just kind of a random experiment with not much on the line, and the question is just purely which of these lines have the same length. Social costs of dissenting may be especially strong in collective societies. Remember that a key goal in collectivist cultural context is to be interdependent or achieve belonging with others, facilitated by trying to fit in. In individualistic cultures, people are motivated to be independent, to highlight their distinctiveness, which fosters a greater sense of independence from others. Costs of dissenting may be relatively less severe in independent cultures. So kind of what these researchers are arguing, that because of collectivism, values embedded within collectivism, individuals are more interdependent, and they're seeking to belong to the group, and thus are facilitated to more motivated to try and fit in, versus kind of this hypothesized individualistic culture wherein people are trying to be independent and foster a greater sense of independence at all costs. So thus, the cost of dissenting may be relatively less severe in independent cultures. So obviously there's a lot to unpack there, and not necessarily true, because often in individualist cultures, people are really just kind of expressing themselves through mass-produced goods, and really not making as many choices as they believe, even though they emphasize choices. But kind of this is the arguments for kind of this approach. So one study looked at this from 1999, and this is kind of known as the pen study. Participants were shown a group of color pens with some colors in the majority and others in the minority. East Asians tended to choose the majority color pens, and the European Americans tended to choose minority color pens. So kind of the idea here is because of this willingness or this motivation to conform, being hypothesized to be larger in collectivist society, belonging to a group and being fitting in with the group. East Asians would be more likely to choose the multicolor pens, or the majority color pen, and this study suggested that is the case, while white Americans choosing the minority color pens, which obviously are many different factors to unpack, and what that would mean in a real world context. But this is kind of the extent of all these studies, is kind of doing these little smaller measures and then trying to draw larger conclusions from them. But that's just one empirical example of this hypothesized argument. Motivations for uniqueness study. Cultural messages are commonly expressed in advertisements. These are parts of the cultural dialogue that feed off and perpetuate cultural norms. Magazine ad study. Compared ads in the United States and South Korea on use of uniqueness and conformity themes. American ads contain more themes of uniqueness than fitting in, and South Korean ads contain more themes of fitting in than uniqueness. So kind of the idea here, which I've already spoken about, is that cultural messages are kind of embedded in media in general, but in this case also in the marketplace, specifically advertisements. And this study in 1999 looking at ads and comparing ads in the United States and South Korea. These researchers found that American ads contain more themes of uniqueness, rather than fitting in, so kind of being an individual, and just being a boss or whatever. South Korean ads contain more themes of fitting in than uniqueness, so kind of thought to reflect these kind of collectivist values and the importance of belonging and fulfilling obligations to a group. In summary, self-enhancement is not a universal phenomenon and is contrasted with self-improvement. Concerns about face in some cultures lead them to have a preventive or prevention orientation, which is contrasted with having a promotion orientation. The importance and definition of choice differ across cultures, even in terms of who makes the decisions. Such cultural differences can often be seen in various types of media outlets. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next week. Bye.